And joining me now from his home in Smithers, BC, is Michael Toledano. Welcome to the CJN Daily. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm glad to see you're out of prison, out of jail. When this podcast is being recorded, how many days has it been since the arrest and imprisonment?
Today's the 3rd of December. I was arrested on the 18th and released 4 days later. And we didn't actually make it to prison. Prison has all sorts of nice amenities like toothbrushes and soap and the ability to call people in the outside world. We were kept in holding cells for the duration and, denied the opportunity to talk to our lawyer. And or I was denied the opportunity to have phone calls with my lawyer. So I've heard that prison would have been an upgrade from the holding cells we were kept in.
Well, I watched some of your footage. I assume you shot it. I know you shot it. That's been released of the actual arrest. And, were you guys expecting this when you were in that situation?
I think the RCMP have both a problematic and difficult history on Wet'suwet'en territory, but also, for years they've been conducting these kind of large-scale militarized operations to take Wet'suwet'en land from underneath Wet'suwet'en people. And so every single time they've come in force, they've either detained journalists, they've, questioned them, they've pointed guns at journalists, they have, removed journalists from the areas that they're trying to do the reporting in.
I'm a member of the media. You've been notified that I'm here. I'm observing.
You're under arrest right now, so step out.
Okay. I'm coming with you. I'm coming with you.
You're under arrest. You don't want to break. Okay. Let's let that guy go.
I'm a member of the media. I'm filming a documentary for CBC television. You are twisting my wrist. I'm a member of the media. I'm filming a documentary for CBC television. I have press credentials. Okay, would you like to see my press credentials?
A day prior, a colleague of mine, Melissa Cox, who's a documentary filmmaker, was arrested, handcuffed, and prevented from filming 14 subsequent arrests, then driven to the nearby town and released. And so, I was expecting that I would probably be arrested just for being in the area and, doing my job and trying to document what was happening on the ground. But I wasn't expecting to be held for 4 days. So I had to make peace with that pretty quickly.
Let's unpack that a little bit. I read some coverage, of course, where the RCMP in its court, or when they appeared in court, basically divulged that they had been tracking you and your colleague. There's some database that the BC police use. This wouldn't be the first time that Jewish activists in history in Canada have been tracked by the RCMP. I've written about it in my own books when the communists were tracked in the 30s before the march on to Ottawa, where they were tracking Jewish communists who were organizing in BC. But was this a surprise to you that they had looked you up and found some police, files on you, or were you aware that that's what's done?
Well, I actually made an access to information request about myself to the RCMP in the year 2016. I filed it, and 5 years later, I got back, a robust file that the police had kept on me. They tracked where my car was, where I had been seen anytime I interacted with police. They had scoured the internet for photographs of me to provide their officers. And so, I've been, viewed with suspicion or viewed as a hostile entity to the RCMP for quite some time. It doesn't surprise me at all that I would be in their prime database.
They also mentioned, you have other stories that you've been covering. And would you say that, you're on their radar, not just for here, but for previous, you're doing this work for many years in Toronto and for Vice and for other Al Jazeera, you're known to police. And I say that in those words, known to police, but not with a record, right?
Yeah, I've never been charged with anything until I was charged with civil breach of the injunction upon my arrest. But one of the things that came up in my police files is that, simply being outside of a refinery in Amjanong, which is a community in southern Ontario, being outside of an imperial oil refinery and being stopped by private security for taking photographs in the course of doing my work. The police investigated me for a mischief charge at the time, and I never found this out until I got my files. So, you know, there's a well-established pattern of protecting the interests of fossil fuel corporations and doing it in a very paranoid and kind of overwrought kind of way.
You know, before we delve into, you know, your own personal background and your family background and how you got into this interview and what you're doing is coming while BC is in one of the worst imaginable flooding and atmospheric river situations. The summer, they had forest fires that 600 people died from the heat dome. You know, what does this say that this is being seen as two white journalists being arrested, as opposed to a bigger story, which is that BC is the, you know, canary in the coal mine for climate change? This is how I'm throwing it out to you. What are your thoughts?
What we saw last summer, there were, you know, massive wildfires throughout the province of British Columbia, and now we see wild floods. There's images of highways that have been washed away. There's people stranded in communities throughout the province. There's people who have been evacuated. There's people who are, you know, who have lost their lives, who are trapped in landslides. And I think it's very telling of the province's priorities that they are declaring an emergency on Wet'suwet'en territory and deploying hundreds of police, plane loads of police by helicopter when those resources could be deployed somewhere else. This is a province that is committed to build the largest hydraulically fractured gas project in Canadian history in the middle of what is, you know, obviously and in a very common sense kind of way, a catastrophic moment. So I would argue that the government is captured by fossil fuel interests and is not working in the service of the people. You know, in the kind of situation that we've seen unfolding in lower British Columbia right now, all hands should be on deck in saving lives and making sure that people are able to, you know, be relieved from whatever emergency or whatever crisis they're enduring.
How did you end up being embedded and devoting the last years of your life to living this story? How did it start?
Well, this is an incredibly important story, and it's always really interested in me as a kind of David and Goliath story since I first encountered the people here. You know, you have a handful of Indigenous leaders and you have some of the largest corporations on earth, and there's always been this confidence and this certainty that the Indigenous people here would be, you know, protecting their land. I've come to understand it as, you know, just this massive conflict over Canada's claim to lands in general throughout this province. There's an area of 22,000 square kilometers that the Wet'suwet'en claim as their own, that Canada has no treaty for, no bill of sale for, no you know, formal agreement. So the only thing that has ever made this a part of Canada has been RCMP violence, has been RCMP officers showing up and removing people from their homes at gunpoint. And this is a, you know, history that spans back to the inception of the RCMP on these territories. So for me, this is a major story about human rights, not just the environment. And I was interested in it initially because I was interested in the environmental angle, and I've come to understand it more and more as a story about, you know, Canada's jurisdiction and authority and the way that Canada has built itself on the backs of Indigenous people and on Indigenous lands.
Now, on your social media, you've called yourself a white settler and doing this work for various media outlets. How does a nice Jewish boy from Toronto become, you know, embedded as an activist, documenting as well? Because it's a fine line too, how you're walking, right, between neutrality and spokespersonness for them.
Well,
so
I'm absolutely.
How did you move from that position to where you are now?
I'm absolutely not a spokesperson for anyone but myself, but I have a point of view which is informed by the information I've gathered, the things I've seen. And I am not pretending that I don't have a point of view. And so, you know, you ask about how a nice Jewish boy ends up so fixated and interested in this issue. You know, my Judaism is primarily cultural, and I think it comes from this, you know, horrific collective experience that so many Jews went through. My grandfather was a Holocaust survivor, Moshe Lozebnik, and my great aunt was a Holocaust survivor as well. They were both partisan resistance soldiers, and my great aunt Faye Schulman is quite well known as a photographer who documented the Jewish resistance within the partisans to, you know, Nazi atrocity. And so I think that Jews, having been through this experience of violent cultural erasure, of genocide, should be able to recognize when it's happening elsewhere, and should be on side and, you know, in a supportive you know, capacity when they recognize that it's happening elsewhere. I think the experience that Jewish people have had and have survived is not dissimilar in many ways to the experience of Indigenous people in Canada. You look at the residential schools and the mass graves that are turning up. This is, you know, like, I know that my whole family on my mother's side, you know, my grandfather's children and his parents and his siblings and their families all ended up in a mass grave. There's a similarity there. The residential schools attempted to criminalize and destroy culture, to make to, you know, to beat children for speaking their language, to erase that sense of identity and self. And also, you know, we talk about, I know in my own family history, you know, our family home was taken over and occupied by Nazis and turned into an operational outpost in the town of Lennon. And the taking up and dispossession of Indigenous lands so that they can become white homes is similar to me. I think that there's so many points of, you know, shared experience, and Jews have a responsibility, in my view, to stand with Indigenous people, you know, in this country who are bearing the brunt of settler colonialism. I think a lot of Jewish people moved out of that experience of trauma and the Holocaust and settled in Canada. But, you know, I can speak from my own experience. I grew up not knowing the first thing about residential schools, the first thing about the Indian Act, the first thing about the pass system, or how, you know, the violent dispossession of this land had occurred and was occurring. And, you know, all that to say that I think a lot of Jewish Canadians are not fully aware or appraised of what is happening so that we can live a better life here. You know, and often are maybe not even aware that they're participating in violence against Indigenous people in passive ways, like through investments, or in active ways. You know, one of the only other Jews in the north here is Nathan Cullen, who's the MP for this area. And he has been an active part of the dispossession of Wet'suwet'en lands for the last decade. The hereditary chiefs were saying, you know, over and over again that they didn't want these projects. He was sitting in the feast hall with them. He was aware of that. And yet, you know, from his position of authority and his position of power, he didn't do anything. So I see that as some, you know, some Jewish people are also complicit in this violence.
The
And
Minister
so,
of Environment is a Holocaust survivor's son. So there you go. Right, George
Yeah.
Heyman. Look, but you know, I think since this summer, and since the discovery of the mass graves, right, in Soquetmec, then I think that may not be true anymore. What you said is that nobody's aware, or Jews aren't aware. I don't think that's the case anymore. They had to take this to get us to this point, right? Which
well,
is a good thing in its horror, and if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I would agree with you to a degree. I think that there's always crises happening in Indigenous communities in Canada, and there was a moment of intense national spotlight over the residential schools, and there was this kind of outpouring of collective grief, but that actually also occurred earlier during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. These stories were coming to light. we shouldn't need the hard empirical truth in the most invasive and upsetting way of bodies coming up from the ground in order to pay attention and care about these things. Like, there are dozens of communities in this country that don't have clean drinking water, and there are dozens of instances of violence happening around us. So I just would urge Canadians to pay more attention, or to sustain their attention, and not just I think that that discovery is kind of the empirical proof that some people may be needed to realize the scale of atrocity in this country. But we still have a long way to go in keeping our energies and our focus on this issue.
Kind of reaction, does your family, when they see this, are they worried about you? Do they give you, do they call you? How does your family feel about the work that you're doing and the scrape you got into? Scrape, and I say that in a nice way. I didn't mean it as to demean it at all.
Well, my mother was, my first consideration, how worried she would be, and I made sure that my lawyer had her contact information so that she could know that I was okay. But if I was held in jail any longer, I'm sure she would have flown out to the side of the country. And she's been attending, rallies in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en, and she's paying attention to the issues. So, there's large parts of my family, I'm sure, that don't see the issues in the same way that I do. But I think that they respect the work that I'm doing and the commitment to telling the story.
Can we just do a little quick explainer for the audience? If you go on the website of the Coastal GasLink, which is owned by TC Energy, you'll see that they say in their second panel that we have the enthusiastic support of 20, right? You're smiling already. 20 chiefs from the Wet'suwet'en. So can you explain what the difference is between the people that you're documenting and those that, according to the company, are all for it? Because it's complicated.
Absolutely. Well, the first thing I'll address is that there are not 20 chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en. There are 20 elected band councils along the pipeline, corridor. That 4 of those are Wet'suwet'en, and so the rest are other nations. But specifically, it's important to understand the history of the Indian Act in this context. And the elected chiefs represent communities that were not that were created by the Canadian government, that were the result of the dispossession of Wet'suwet'en territories at gunpoint. Wet'suwet'en people used to live all throughout the 22,000 square kilometers that they claim today as their own. But what happened in the 1910s throughout the 1960s was that Indian agents and RCMP arrived, removed people from those traditional territories, and forced them onto reserves. And so those communities are the ones that are governed by the elected councillors. There's a low degree of participation, political participation, in that system, but concurrently the Wet'suwet'en also have maintained their traditional system, which, as a Jewish person who has all of the stories about people, going into their basements to maintain their prayers and their cultural practices, I think is just an incredible story of resilience. The Wet'suwet'en people have the feast hall where they govern themselves, where they make decisions for the territories, and where they make decisions about specific pieces of land. And that system was criminalized by Canada until 1951. The result of gathering and having a feast would be that people would be surveilled or arrested. And so that system went underground. The chiefs, who were simultaneously, the chiefs and the people who were simultaneously enduring residential school in an effort to wipe out their culture, somehow kept this system of governance alive. And it's one of the only intact, traditional systems of governance that's operating at scale in Canada today that I'm aware of, along with, a few others that are in this region. But, there's a whole, there's 2 concurrent governments. There's one that was imposed and created by Canada, which has legal jurisdiction over the reserves, where the pipeline does not actually, go. And then there's the hereditary system, where the hereditary chiefs act as spokespeople for their clans and their house groups, which are basically family groups. And that is the system that has gone to the Supreme Court of Canada, with the hereditary chiefs as spokespeople for their families, and has had the Supreme Court of Canada affirm that Wet'suwet'en people have never given up their rights and title to this piece of land. So there, I think that the reality is that both the elected councils and the hereditary chiefs are acting in the interests of their people, because the councils have to worry about municipalities. They have to worry about, funding services. They have to worry about, providing the necessities of life to their people. And they are in a situation of imposed and structural poverty. And so when money is being, offered to them only if they sign on to these benefits agreements and only if they accept these projects on their lands, it's not really a choice, because regardless of if they say yes or no, the project will be built at gunpoint. And so, I think a lot of elected leaders have felt and have expressed, though not publicly because they're contractually obligated to only speak well of the project, have expressed, that this was not a decision made freely. This is a decision made under duress.
Now, when you were in those cabins, work camps, at the checkpoints at different places along the highway to where the pipe link, the CGL pipe camps are, with the 500 men and women that are working there, the two houses. What is it? Where do you live? And can you describe like how you stay? What is it? A heated kind of house with propane heaters and or is there a bathroom? Because I only saw it from looking out at it, and then you were, gone. Describe what your situation is like there when you're there.
Well, in the summer, I spend a great deal of time camping and living in my vehicle. But there's also, a lot of infrastructure that Wet'suwet'en people have built on their own territories. There is a 3-story healing center with a number of bedrooms that the Unistoten have built. There's cabins, there's, multiple homes and bunkhouses. There's wall tents, and where the raid occurred recently was a tiny house that was adjacent to a Coastal GasLink drill site where they plan to drill beneath Wet'suwet'en waters. So, the thing that is always interesting to me is the RCMP and government always seem to think, oh, well, it's the dead of winter. People are not going to be able to stay out there. And, the reality is that Wet'suwet'en people are super tough and resilient, and they are able to find a way to stay warm and dry in -40.
Okay, so be specific. What does that actually look like?
There's wall tents, there's wood heat, there's like cabins, like I said, and tiny houses, which are, homes on trailers that are, built with insulation and are actually quite comfortable. There's solar power for a lot of this. There's a great deal of infrastructure, and some of it is portable and some of it is permanent.
And bathrooms and stuff, or toilets. How do you wash? Where do you sleep? Or you sleep in your car?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's showers at the Unistoten Healing Center. And there's, outhouses all over the place, and there's bathrooms in certain places. And
coming back to your roots and, being the Jewish reporter there, do you ever experience any anti-Semitism or other things that would be uncomfortable for you from people there? Do they know you're Jewish?
Well, there's a lot of, racism and anti-Semitism in the North, for sure. There is the holding cell I was kept in at the Prince George Courthouse not only had blood spattered on the wall, but had swastikas carved into it. A swastika was just put on Nathan Collins', billboard on the highway. And there are, white supremacists in the towns up here that fly Confederate flags. It's such an interesting relationship that, as an part Ashkenaz and part Sephardic Jew, but as a, white person, that I have to whiteness, because I'm experience the world as being white until a Nazi finds out that I'm Jewish. And so I haven't explicitly experienced anti-Semitism, but I have been, shot at by white supremacists who have come to one of the camps and fired off guns. I have been, oddly kind of brought into the fold with a lot of the anti-Indigenous violence that I've seen up here, and been on the receiving end of that just merely by being out here.
I wish you good luck, and we'd like to keep in touch and see how this plays out. The other thing is that because of this now, there is this chill effect. Even what you just said of second guessing how and what you do, this is what happens. And sometimes at some point, the effectiveness of your coverage becomes an issue too, because they may not. It's the chill effect of silencing, that you have to cope with, not only as a person, but as a reporter, right?
I think this is precisely where I can draw upon the strength of my ancestors and my grandfather and, my great aunt Faye Schulman, and think about the unbelievable amounts of trauma and violence they had to go through, and how they were still, able to capture images, beautiful images of the resistance that they were, in that case, fighting to avenge their families. I think that, it's really important in this context to not only have images of violence against Indigenous people, of Indigenous people being victimized, but to document how this is an incredible and resilient resistance. And so I have to channel some of that resilience myself, and I won't be scared away from following this story.
Understood. It's been amazing talking to you. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you.
Thanks for being on the CJN Daily.